Hey guys, this video is about the Compromise of 1850, and this is the very creative handout that it goes with, which says the Compromise of 1850. And this is a really important bridge from the last unit to this coming unit, because what's happened is in the Mexican War we won all this new land. And had we not won the new land, we probably could have avoided the Civil War, because the status of slavery in all the other parts of the territory had been solved, okay? We had, in the North there was freedom, in the South there was slavery, and then we had the Missouri Compromise that settled the Louisiana Purchase, North and South. And so, in Oregon it was free. So we pretty much had decided the whole United States slavery issues up to that point. But then we're going to gain this new land from the Mexican Cession, and the big crisis is going to break out, what we're going to do about the slavery question, okay? So let's look at the map very quickly, and let me explain to you why California is going to be the first state that tries to enter the Union, even though it's the furthest west on the map. So, if you look here, you can see that this red and is all the territory we gained from the Mexican Cession, and then we bought this part from the Gadsden Purchase. Now, to become a state, you have to have 60,000 people in the territory. So, the gold rush had brought lots of people to settle all along the coast of California. But in order to have California enter, so that's why California is going to be the first territory from this whole Mexican Cession that wants to become a state, because they're the ones that have the most population because of the gold rush. And also, you need it to be a long vertical state like this to include all the coastal settlements and get you to the 60,000 number. So a lot of people would assume that maybe what we would do in the Mexican Cession is just extend this 3630 line on into the new territory, but you can see that if you do that, you're going to just bisect California. And you can't have a state that's half free and half slave. It's almost impossible to enforce. You know, you can't have different laws in one part of North Carolina and then another part of North Carolina, and then you'd be consistent across the state. So as a result, that's going to lead to a huge crisis about, well, what are we going to do about California? Is it going to be free or slave? And there are all these other issues swirling around too. And so Henry Clay decided to just roll all these kind of simmering issues between the North and South, roll them into one huge law called the Compromise of 1850. And so the Compromise of 1850 comes to fruition thanks to, well, we all know who wrote the Compromise of 1850. It was
Henry Clay!
Oh my gosh, look at that. It like came out of nowhere. Henry Clay. Yes, he did write the Compromise of 1850. So the first thing I need you to notice here is that on this chart you have the South and you have the North. It'd be kind of smart if you got like two different kinds of writing utensils to show the South and the North's position, because then you can kind of keep track of who's winning over here in the Compromise position. I'm going to be doing this by having the South be indicated by gray and the North being indicated by blue, because in the Civil War they're the blue, the North, against the gray, the South, okay? So you kind of help keep score in terms of who's winning in the Compromise. So the South, obviously they wanted California to be open to slavery, and so the North wanted California to be closed to slavery. So they both have staked out very different positions there. The Compromise position was that California would be free. So which side wins there? The North. And so in the Compromise, the idea is that slavery would not spread to California. The next issue is a border dispute between Texas and New Mexico. And let's back up here and look at what that dispute is. You can see that here is where Texas is. Today, Texas is cut off here. But back then, this was Texas and this was New Mexico. And New Mexico thought that this gray area should be New Mexico instead of Texas. And so there was a dispute. Of course, the Southerners want this gray part to remain part of Texas, because Texas was already slave, and so that would be a territory open to slavery. The Northerners wanted this part here to be New Mexico, but also this part, because then there was a chance that this whole area here could be free if they determined that New Mexico was going to be free. So let me make this clear. So the Southern position is they wanted Texas to get the land since Texas had slaves, and the North wanted New Mexico to get the land because New Mexico's status was yet undetermined. So, oh, I'm sorry, this was tilted up. And so, they were hoping to get more of Texas broken over and make it part of New Mexico so that it wouldn't have slaves. Okay? The Compromise position is a smart one. Texas had some significant debts that it was dealing with, and so the Compromise position is that New Mexico is going to get the land, but Texas is going to get money. And so this made both sides happy. The Northerners wouldn't have slavery in that territory, yet at least, and Texas would get some money for giving up their land claims. Okay? The next issue was slavery in Washington, D.C., and the Northerners were upset about slavery everywhere, but they particularly were upset about slavery in our nation's capital. The reason is, let me explain a little bit about this. The reason is that lots of diplomats and dignitaries and foreigners came to our capital to do business and lobby our government. And when they came, they saw these open-air slave markets going on. And you've got to keep in mind that all the European nations and all the other nations in our continent have made slavery illegal. So we're kind of embarrassed for these diplomats to come and see us not only hold slaves, but more controversially, to be actually selling slaves in these open-air slave markets. What that involves is the slaves are actually stripped naked, and they stand up on these pedestals for a couple days at a time, and people come and inspect them and look at their bodies and inspect them like an animal that they're considering for purchase. And then on the day that the auction actually starts, they start auctioning slaves off, and oftentimes that means they're going to be dividing their families or splitting married people or taking children from their mothers. And there's horrible, horrible emotional just terrorism that happens to these people. And so it's very fraught with emotion. And so we're particularly embarrassed about the fact that this is going on in the nation's capital. So the Northerners want slavery, if it's not made illegal everywhere, to at least make it illegal in the nation's capital, because this is just kind of very embarrassing for the nation to have foreigners kind of see this dirty laundry that's going on with the slave trade. So what the North wants in the question of slavery in D.C. is they want to keep slavery. The South wants to keep slavery in Washington, D.C. Okay, so the Southern position is keep slavery. The North's position is to end slavery in Washington, D.C. The compromise position is to keep slavery in the capital, so you can hold slaves in the nation's capital, but you can't buy or sell a slave in the nation's capital. If you want to buy or sell your slave, you have to take it to some other state or other part of Virginia, but you can't buy and sell slaves in Washington, D.C. Okay? The next issue involves fugitive slaves. And so let's talk very quickly about what a fugitive is. You might be aware of, in popular culture, fugitives are people who are running from the law. In this case, the people running from the law are slaves. So let me just tell you why fugitive slaves are becoming more common, and that's because of this map here. You can see that this is the Underground Railroad. And the Underground Railroad was these kind of routes that were used to smuggle escaped slaves to safety in the North and then ultimately to Canada. The idea was that these escaped slaves, at least in the Southern perspective, that these escaped slaves are stolen property, and that they should be returned, and that anyone who is harboring an escaped slave is in possession of stolen property. And so what they want is a stronger fugitive slave law passed. Okay, so let me just help make sure you understand the Underground Railroad. Most of my students have studied it to some degree. They would take the slaves would escape from their masters, and they would start running at night from house to house, safe house to safe house, where Quakers or other people who were living in the South who opposed slavery would help hide them, and then send them on their way in the evening to the next safe place. So it wasn't a literal subway, it was, or a literal railroad, it was a figurative, symbolic railroad. Well, to fight the Underground Railroad, the Southerners want a stronger fugitive slave law, which would mean that if you were found to be harboring an escaped slave, there would be much more severe penalties, and that you would be forced to return them to their masters if they had escaped. The North feels like that if escaped slaves get north, that it's kind of like home base, and that they should not be forced to participate in the return of those slaves to their masters. The compromise position here is that Henry Clay decides that we'll have a more strict fugitive slave law, and that will hopefully appease Southerners. You can see by now that we have a lot of blue here, which means things that made the North happy, but we have fewer gray things that make the South happy. So this is the first compromise portion that makes the South alone totally happy. Now you can see why this is kind of a smart thing for the North to agree to, because everyone in the North can play dumb. They can say, well, I didn't know he was a slave. He had free papers. Back then, blacks who were not slaves often carried on them free papers that proved that they were legally not a slave, that they were were not bound to return to anyone. So they could just play dumb or say, you know, we thought he had free papers. He showed us some free papers. So it'd be really hard to prove, actually, that someone was intentionally harboring a slave. And so I think this might be why, though the North was outraged by these fugitive slave laws and will actually pass their own counter to them called personal liberty laws, I think actually it had been pretty hard for prosecutors in the North, if they were willing to take up a fugitive slave case, to prove that the Northerners actually did harbor a slave with intention. So it's kind of a tricky business in terms of the enforceability of the fugitive slave law anyway. But the next issue is slavery in New Mexico and Utah, the other territories that are gained from the Mexican War, but we haven't determined their slave status yet either. The South, of course, wants slavery to be present in those territories, and the North wants to ban slavery in those territories. So this is when a new position is adopted that makes everyone happy. It's considered to be very democratic. It's called popular sovereignty, and that's where the people in the territory get to vote whether they're going to have slavery or not. You can see I've made every other word here gray and blue because this makes both sides happy. They both hope that they can win that election and that their side will prevail. And so the Southerners hope that slavery will come to the new territories of Utah and New Mexico, and the Northerners, of course, hope that they can stop the spread of slavery there. So this is the whole package. Of course, remember, the Compromise of 1850 was written by
Henry Clay.
good old Henry Clay. But there were some other major figures who were involved in the debate. Henry Clay was very old by this time. He was really on his way out. Him and John Calhoun are still living, but frail and weak. Calhoun actually opposed the Compromise of 1850, as did President Taylor, and we'll talk more about that when we watch the President series about why President Taylor opposed it. But President Taylor mysteriously dies in the middle of the debate and passage of the Compromise of 1850. And in fact, they think that he could have been poisoned, and they will bring him, they will exhume his body in the late 1900s. They'll exhume his body and test to see if, in fact, he was poisoned over the Compromise of 1850. And I won't spoil the result. We'll watch a movie on that and determine if he was or not. But his vice president, Millard Fillmore, became president. So Daniel Webster is Henry Clay's right-hand man. He, of course, argues for the Compromise of 1850. President Fillmore, who was Taylor's vice president, who became president upon the death of Taylor, he supports it. And that is how eventually it's going to get passed, is by President Fillmore's willingness to sign it. Henry Clay wrote it, but Henry Clay was actually too frail to work it and get it passed through Congress. So Stephen Douglas, the next great kind of rising star, he will get it passed in parts. He will pass it in separate parts because he knew there was at least one part of the compromise that each person would feel so strongly about that they would vote against the whole thing because they didn't like that one part. But he knew that if he broke it into parts, that each part would pass, and therefore the whole compromise would be achieved. So it is passed thanks to the guidance of Stephen Douglas, who guides it through both houses of Congress, and it does get passed. And the Compromise of 1850 is going to very successfully show how our politicians' willingness to work towards a compromise actually brings peace to the land for 10 more years at least. So the Compromise of 1850 is really important. This is a famous painting of the Compromise of 1850 that kind of shows all the major players there. It was the most intense debate in U.S. history. There's nowhere for you to write this down, but there's a John Calhoun who was watching the debate of the compromise. And then also there's Daniel Webster, who's doing the speaking in defense of it. And then Henry Clay is pictured there behind Daniel Webster, lending him support. And John C. Calhoun's position was that the North should honor the Constitution and enforce the Fugitive Slave Law. And that was the most important part of it. The South wanted California also, and they threatened to secede from the United States over the issue. He said that the U.S. should have two presidents, actually, one from the North and one from the South. So you can see that John C. Calhoun's position was actually quite radical for its time. Daniel Webster thought that secession was impractical and impossible, and he didn't think that we could actually split the land or the military, and he thought we needed a compromise at all costs to preserve the Union. So those were the two major arguments that were made in the day. Henry Clay, of course, is the great compromiser, and with John C. Calhoun, Daniel Webster, and Stephen Douglas, this is the compromise they could come up with. So I think the main takeaway message for today, particularly today's politics, which are one of rancor and division, is that even though these men had such radically different positions, that eventually they did come together, and this compromise was passed, and brought us relative peace. So that's the Compromise of 1850. I'll see you later. And once again, remember, the Compromise of 1850 was written by
Henry Clay!
Yay! We'll be seeing you.